I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked.
Beat poetry is intrinsically anarchistic, free expressionist. In its worst aspects, it's just syrupy sentimentality. And in its best aspects, it can really engage in the political dimension of the society.
A beat poet is a poet who sits down to write with no preconception about what it is he or she is going to write, and let the language come through you, let the words flow.
Compared with traditional closed-form rhymed poetry of England of the 19th century, and America too, beat poetry is more street down to earth.
The Beat Generation was a group of American writers who came to significant importance in the 1950s. Central influences of the beat culture include a rebellion against mainstream American values, the experimentation with drugs, the use of alternate forms of sexuality, and an interest in Eastern spirituality. The ideals of the Beat Generation moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 50s. Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Gregory Corso, and Neal Cassady all were influential beat poets that lived in San Francisco for an extended amount of time. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, one of the owners of City Lights bookstore, began to publish these poets, and the Beat Generation began to grow.
A lot of us started writing poetry as kind of protection against this awful conformity and this awful suffocation of the quote-unquote American family and the idea of the madness of war.
It was rebellious, and that spirit of rebellion is very much part of rebellion against the status quo, against the establishment, against materialism, meaning love of money and everything that gets you, and censorship.
The Beat Generation opened up poetry in the 50s by discovering, finding, or manifesting the rhythms and the natural slang, American slang, and imagery that came and was inspired from jazz. The Beat Generation was related to jazz.
And jazz music and the emphasis on improvisation, spur-of-the-moment creativity, not being part of the mainstream.
Jazz and poetry together was a very important aspect of whatever was happening in poetry at that time.
San Francisco became the main place for it. The most famous place, the place where there were the most people, the place where they seemed to congregate the most, and where a lot of the things happened here that grew.
Well, it began with a reading called the Six Gallery Read. There were, I think, 5 poets that read: Gary Snyder, Philip Lamantia, Allen Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, and Kenneth Rexroth, who was the oldest of the whole group.
Classically, beat poetry came out of certain individuals, but Gregory Corso, who wrote a book called The Happy Birthday of Death.
Bob Kaufman, who was a black Jewish poet and one of the great poets of the Beat Generation.
Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road and the Dharma Bums, Big Sur, Desolation Angels.
Howard Hart, who worked with jazz and read poetry.
Allen Ginsberg, who wrote Howl. William Burroughs, who wrote Naked Lunch. And because they brought a lot of excitement, because people don't read poetry that much, especially what you'd call protest or outsider poetry. They brought a lot of excitement, and so a lot of younger people started coming out of their poetry closets and reading publicly.
The cases of the beat, that was important, where Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was a publisher of Howl, had to go to court for Allen's book, Howl, because Allen used certain obscenities.
And it's a poem of about 25 pages or so with very long lines, and it kind of gives this nightmare vision of America. And it was published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti City Lights Press. So we're here in 2010. This book came out in 1956, and it was subject to an obscenity trial. Members of the San Francisco Police Department Juvenile Division, aptly named, went into City Lights and bought the book from the bookseller and arrested him for selling pornography. And then they arrested Lawrence Ferlinghetti for publishing the book, and there was a great trial held. The prosecution had a couple of witnesses, and the defense, the people fighting for Ginsberg, had as many witnesses as they wanted from universities and poets from all over the place, saying that this is nonsense. This is a great American poem expressing outrage at the way our society is.
That was very important because it had to do with freedom of speech on the surface, freedom of speech.
The 50s was a time when society kept a pretty big lid on things. That's one of the influences that caused these people to react against it, okay? And drugs were a symbol of that. Using drugs was a symbol of that.
The philosophy of the Beat generation was really schmoogadoo, what I call schmoogadoo, or marijuana. That was really the ground of it.
A lot of us took LSD, but it's unfortunate that a lot of the great beat daddies were heroin addicts, but it didn't do so bad in terms of they did a lot of work.
It makes you see things differently. It has an effect on you.
San Francisco was a great place for the Beats because it was generally a pretty liberal city compared to the rest of America.
The Beats were inspirational to many different forms of poetry. And basically because it was looser. It was looser on the page. It loosened up. So poets were not so much interested in remaining so tight-formed.
This whole tradition of the artist being a truth teller and telling it in whatever way they can, even if they don't get much recognition or money or fame, you know, whatever, out of it, but that it's what's important for itself. That's a very long tradition that goes way, way back. And the beat thing is just the form that took in the 50s and into the 60s.